Now, as you may already know, our brains are not terribly reliable in terms of their ability to assess situations, examine data, and also create reliable information. We are prone, all of us, to a range of cognitive biases, social influences, the influence of cultural frameworks and beliefs and ideologies, as well as our own professional tendencies and training that, when all taken together, can severely and does severely limit our ability to see what's happening out there in the world beyond our own perception, and also figure out how to take it all in, understand it, and chart a path through it. If we take a look at this cognitive bias image, which lays out a range of cognitive biases that we can fall victim to, and there's quite a few, as you can see, we can see how pervasive cognitive bias can be. Now, the bad news, and it's kind of bad news, is that cognitive bias is part of our wiring. And we have this bias limitation just by virtue of being human beings. It's pretty inescapable that we are going to fall victim to some form of cognitive bias. And the biases we carry with us are going to influence our judgment in one way, shape, or form. Now, the good news, on the other hand, is that our brains are also adaptable. And like the rest of our physiological systems, our brain can be improved in terms of its ability to overcome that bias with exercise and hard work, just like you might go to the gym or exercise your respiratory system, your muscular system, your circulatory system. You can also train your thinking systems, if that's a word, in order to overcome bias. Well, the first step in improving our critical thinking is to become aware of our weaknesses and areas that need addressing. By becoming aware of our cognitive biases and the tendencies of thought that we have based on our previous experience, our cultural frameworks, our social systems, and our professional training, we can see where our weaknesses lie, where we're most vulnerable, and what steps we need to take in order to improve our thinking and overcome those limitations. Now, this might not be easy to do because, after all, who likes to focus on their weaknesses? No one likes to look at themselves in the mirror and see where we're going wrong, where our limitations are. Kind of like a Medusa doesn't like to look at herself in the mirror and turn to stone. And when doing so with others, it might feel like we're being overly critical. We really don't like to call out other people on their biases, especially if we're trying to maintain a close and personal relationship with them, because they too can take offense to those assessments. But being critical, critically thinking, and being honest in our assessments and being aware of these biases is a really crucial part of critical thinking. This leads us to the second part that we need to keep in mind when trying to become aware of the limitations we have in our critical thinking. And that's being self-reflective with honesty and without judgment. And this also includes being reflective and being aware of what other people are doing, what their tendencies are, how they're thinking. Now, we might have certain biases against certain groups, whatever those groups might be, regions of the world or regions of our own countries, schools of thoughts or paradigms. We might be biased towards certain cultures or religions or even fans of sports teams and the like. Now, we need to be honest with ourselves and with each other in order to know where those vulnerabilities are and where we need to improve. Because one thing we do know from looking at the way in which disinformation has been targeted against societies is that those fault lines, those areas of widespread bias, are fertile ground for creating a lot of problems in society by working on people's emotional biases and driving a wedge in populations. When we're looking at biases, we're doing so not just to blame or to cast aspersions or to call people out, but we're just doing it to acknowledge and to become aware. And acknowledging or admitting you have a problem is the first step towards improving and, using that metaphor of admitting a problem, recovery. And what we're trying to do is recover from our biases and improve our critical thinking. The third thing we need to do is we need to have a healthy skepticism of the loudest and most dominant voices that tend to dominate some area of thought, some area of education, some area of profession, some area of belief. For instance, Thomas Kuhn, in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, discusses how dominant paradigms can stop progress in the forms of new paradigms or new discoveries. New voices can and do get drowned out by these established voices. Thus, while we might listen to and try to learn from those existing voices, it's always important to look at what's been established and what has come before us. We also need to think critically about them as well. Because if we just keep our thinking limited in those former paradigms, those old ways of thinking, we're never going to be able to move forward into new ways of thinking, into new paradigms. Here's an example that some of you may already be familiar with. In the prelude to World War II, it was not believed that the Japanese could be good pilots. It was not believed that the Japanese could have the manufacturing expertise, the engineering expertise, even the physiological ability to pilot aircraft, especially military or attack aircraft. Part of this lied in good old-fashioned racism. The belief was that the ways in which Japanese phenotypical features, such as eye shape, looked, that would limit their ability to be able to see, that they in fact lacked good eyesight and therefore couldn't be able to identify other fighters, other airplanes, or other threats, that they would be easy pickings from the sky. A lot of this was rooted in this Western belief, this ethnocentrism, that the West was superior, both racially and culturally and technologically. But of course, that view of Western superiority and Japanese inferiority was proven wrong with quite dramatic outcomes. In a compelling commentary from the online publication War on the Rocks, the authors explore how prejudice and groupthink made the US vulnerable to Japanese military aggression and the Pearl Harbor attack. From that article, quote, "For national security professionals, prejudice is dangerous. Prejudice is fatal. The prejudicial unwillingness of Admiral Kimmel, Admiral Short, and others to posture adequately against a potential Japanese aerial attack was fatal 80 years ago today. Pearl Harbor is a concrete example that demonstrates how devastating ethnocentric bias brought on by large homogeneous institutions can be." We can see similar kinds of ethnocentric beliefs in looking at more contemporary examples. For instance, there's certain beliefs about what Arab culture is, what Islam is, or what other groups are, especially those groups who we identify as primary adversaries. And that ethnocentrism, that bias, that lack of critical thinking can lead to grave errors in judgment and action as well, as some of you probably have experienced firsthand. Now, fourth, we also need to be aware of something called metacognition. Metacognition is just a fancier way of saying we have to be aware of our own thought processes and patterns that lead to them. We have to be aware of our own thinking. We have to be aware of how we go through information to make decisions and the factors that influence that decision-making process. Planning a task, what is the goal, what is needed, how it is collected, what we are missing. All of these things we should really think about in terms of how we do it and how we can improve on it. We also can think about how we reflect on that, whether by ourselves or in coordination with others. We can think about our learning styles, whether we're auditory learners, visual learners, reading and writing learners, or we learn by doing. We might create a checklist, a metacognition checklist. Surgeons often will use a checklist to make sure that the procedure they're doing is the right one, to make sure everyone is on page with what the procedure is, whether the patient's the right patient, and so on. So just taking some extra time to formulate our thought process, our thinking processes, by ourselves and with others can be really useful to helping overcome our bias and increase awareness of our limitations. So here are some things that you can do to help improve your awareness of your biases and your limitation in your thinking and thought processes. First, create an inventory of your own personal biases, whatever they might be, no matter how small or how large, how insignificant or how significant. You don't have to do an implicit bias test, although there are plenty of those out there. But you might just think about the things that you know, or you think you know, or stereotypical beliefs you have about different kinds of groups. Think about the prejudicial tendencies that you see yourself falling back on in your everyday life. What kinds of information sources are you biased against? You can think about that as well. What don't you trust and what do you trust and why? Do you have good reasons for that? And by good reasons, I mean not just your own belief, but there are verifiable reasons that lead certain kinds of sources to be reliable and other kinds of sources to be not reliable. What kinds of things do you dismiss out of hand right away? What kind of things do you not even want to consider? What kind of viewpoints do you dismiss because of who they're coming from and what the source of that claim is? What are your reasons for doing so? Create a list of all those things to help you become more self-aware of what your limitations are. Another thing you can do is monitor your own emotional reactions to news stories and information. If you look at weaponized information, it can be easy to find because it typically tries to elicit an emotional reaction. So, does a story that you're reading prompt you to feel in a certain kind of way? Are certain kinds of words used to prompt a emotional reaction, especially an anger or a fear reaction? Those are very, very powerful emotions to get us to act in certain ways and actually not to think. If you use those two approaches, you might find it helps you to create a better sense of awareness. Now, you don't have to go through and look at all the cognitive biases and figure out which ones you have and which one you don't. Start simple, start general, work from there, and then start to think about in a more refined way the particular kinds of biases you're most prone to and the particular kinds of information or disinformation you might be more prone to fall victim to. So with that, what other kinds of recommendations do you have to create more of an awareness of your critical thinking? What kind of things have you done in the past, whether it be training programs or just tricks you use to make sure that your own thinking is not harmed by bias, stereotype, prejudice, and ethnocentrism? Make sure to share them in the group discussion or the comments to this video, and we'll all take a look at them. And I think together, by sharing those experiences, we all can become more aware of the things that limit our ability to think critically. Thanks.